Saint Augustine, a convert and doctor of the Church who is the patron of theologians and printers. Augustine was born on November 13, in 354, Tagaste, Numidia, Algeria, Africa. He died on August 28, in 430, Hippo Regius, Numidia, Algeria. Saint Augustine is the patron saint of brewers, printers, and theologians. His father, Patricius, one of the curiales of the city, was still a pagan. However, the admirable virtues that made Monica the ideal of Christian mothers at length brought her husband the grace of baptism and of a holy death, about the year 371. Augustine received a Christian education. His mother had him signed with the cross and enrolled among the catechumens. Once, when very ill, he asked for baptism, but, all danger being soon past, he deferred receiving the sacrament. But a great intellectual and moral crisis stifled for a time all these Christian sentiments. Augustine had to spend his 16th year at Tagaste. Before long he was obliged to confess to Monica that he had formed a sinful relationship with a woman who bore him a son, in 372. In 373, Augustine and his friend Honoritus joined the heretical Manichaeans. He was afterwards baptized with him at Milan, but Monica deeply deplored Augustine's heresy and would not have received him into her home or at her table but for the advice of a saintly bishop, who declared that the son of so many tears could not perish. The illusion had lasted 9 years. The religious crisis of this great soul was only to be resolved in Italy, under the influence of St. Ambrose. Having visited Bishop Ambrose, the fascination of that saint's kindness induced him to become a regular attendant at his preaching. However, before embracing the faith, Augustine underwent a 3-year struggle. Monica, who had joined her son at Milan, prevailed upon him to become betrothed, but his affianced bride was too young, and although Augustine dismissed the mother of Adeodatus, her place was soon filled by another. Finally, through the reading of the Holy Scripture, light penetrated his mind. Soon he possessed the certainty that Jesus Christ is the only way to truth and salvation. In 386, he went with Monica, his son Adeodatus, and his friends to Cassiziacum. Augustine gradually became acquainted with Christian doctrine. He completed the education of his young friends. It was this divine grace that Augustine sought in Christian baptism. Towards the beginning of Lent, 387, he went to Milan and, with Adeodatus and Alypius, took his place among the combatants, being baptized by Ambrose during Eastertide. It was at this time that Augustine, Alypius, and Evodius resolved to retire into solitude in Africa. In the autumn of 387, he was about to embark at Ostia, when Monica died. In all literature there are no pages of more exquisite sentiment than the story of her saintly death and Augustine's grief. He sailed for Africa after the death of the Maximus, August 388, and after a short sojourn in Carthage, returned to his native Tagaste. Immediately upon arriving there, he wished to carry out his idea of a perfect life, and began by selling all his goods and giving the proceeds to the poor. Then he and his friends withdrew to his estate, which had already been alienated, there to lead a common life in poverty, prayer, and the study of sacred letters. Augustine did not think of entering the priesthood, and, through fear of the episcopacy. One day, having been summoned to Hippo by a friend whose soul's salvation was at stake, he was praying in a church when the people suddenly gathered about him, cheered him, and begged Valerius, the bishop, to raise him to the priesthood. In spite of his tears, Augustine was obliged to yield to their entreaties, and was ordained in 391. The new priest looked upon his ordination as an additional reason for resuming religious life at Tagaste, and so fully did Valerius approve that he put some church property at Augustine's disposal, thus enabling him to establish a monastery, the second that he had founded. His priestly ministry of 5 years was admirably fruitful. Valerius had bidden him preach, in spite of the deplorable custom which in Africa reserved that ministry to bishops. Augustine combated heresy, especially Manichaeism, and his success was prodigious. He took part, in 393, the plenary council of Africa, presided over by Aurelius, bishop of Carthage, and, at the request of the bishops, was obliged to deliver a discourse which, in its completed form, afterwards became the treatise De Fide et Symbolo. Enfeebled by old age, Valerius, bishop of Hippo, was soon succeeded by Augustine as bishop. He was then 42, and was to occupy the See of Hippo for 34 years. The new bishop understood well how to combine the exercise of his pastoral duties with the austerities of the religious life, and although he left his convent, his episcopal residence became a monastery where he lived a community life with his clergy, who bound themselves to observe religious poverty. But he was above all the defender of truth and the shepherd of souls. His doctrinal activities, the influence of which was destined to last as long as the Church itself, were manifold. He preached frequently, sometimes for 5 days consecutively, his sermons breathing a spirit of charity that won all hearts. He wrote letters which scattered broadcast through the then known world his solutions of the problems of that day. He impressed his spirit upon divers African councils at which he assisted. After Augustine became bishop, the zeal which, from the time of his baptism, he had manifested in bringing his former coreligionists into the true church. In his writings, Augustine takes up the defense of free will. His works against the Manichaean are an inexhaustible storehouse of arguments in this still living controversy. In 426 the holy bishop of Hippo, at the age of 72, wishing to spare his episcopal city the turmoil of an election after his death, caused both clergy and people to acclaim the choice of the deacon Heraclius as his auxiliary and successor, and transferred to him the administration of externals. Augustine might then have enjoyed some rest had Africa not been agitated by the undeserved disgrace and the revolt of Count Boniface, 427. The Goths, sent by the Empress Placidia to oppose Boniface, and the Vandals, whom the latter summoned to his assistance, were all Arians. Maximinus, an Arian bishop, entered Hippo with the imperial troops. The holy doctor defended the faith at a public conference, 428, and in various writings. Being deeply grieved at the devastation of Africa, he labored to effect a reconciliation between Count Boniface and the Empress. Peace was indeed re-established, but not with Genseric, the Vandal king. Boniface, vanquished, sought refuge in Hippo, whither many bishops had already fled for protection, and this well-fortified city was to suffer the horrors of an 18-month siege. He was stricken with what he realized to be a fatal illness, and, after 3 months of admirable patience and fervent prayer, died on 28th of August, 430, in the 76th year of his age. Please subscribe to Catholic News World's YouTube channel. Thanks and God bless.